Good afternoon. Buenos días para algunos. Welcome to the webinar, Vendors, Public Space and Activism in Mexico and California. We are very pleased to have our guest speakers today, as well as all of you in the audience who are joining for the event. My name is Christian Solnitzky. I'm a professor of anthropology and also a researcher at the Center for Mexican American Studies at the University of Texas in Arlington. And I also serve as an editor of the journal Mexican Studies Estudios Mexicanos. Today we are pleased to host this webinar on the topic of street vendors in Mexico and California with 4 experts who have recently published books on this topic. Now, before we get started, I'd like to thank the people and organizations who have made this webinar possible. First, I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Latin American Institute at UCLA and its director, Ruben Hernandez Leon, as well as all of his team. Also to Gaspar, my colleague, Gaspar Rivera Salgado, who is director of the Center for Mexican Studies, also at UCLA. And finally to CIMAS, the Center for Mexican American Studies, and its staff, and my colleagues here at UTA. So today we gather to talk about, like I said, street vendors in Mexico and the US, and their struggle to carry their work both in past times and in the present. You know, I was thinking about this topic and kind of realized that since the early 2000s, there has been an increasing interest in studying the lives of street vendors who make a living in large cities in both Mexico and the US, particularly in California. The topic has attracted increasing attention by anthropologists, sociologists, historians, and other scholars in both sides of the US-Mexico border. Myself was attracted to this topic when I was carrying ethnographic fieldwork on the lives of Mexican immigrants in Silicon Valley back in the 1990s. And I literally bumped into all sorts of street vendors in the city of San Jose, which, by the way, was a very pleasant research experience. Now, while this renowned interest in the street vendors and the informal economy is reflected in scholarly publications, what distinguishes the work of our guests today is that they all have opened new doors to address topics that had not received much attention in the literature before. Thus, all of their books bring to the forefront important issues such as the rights of street vendors to the city, their contributions to the public good and society, novel forms of labor and community organizing that they have developed, as well as the role of women's social networks in sustaining those forms of community organization, among other topics. So the goal of today's seminar is to provide the authors an open forum to talk and discuss, talk about their books, reflect about what they have learned from their research, and then elicit a live discussion with the audience about those topics and others that might come up in the discussion. Now, to that end, the format of our webinar, we have 3 parts. First of all, I'm going to be introducing each of our guest speakers one at a time, and they will provide a brief overview of their books. After that, we are going to engage. I'm going to be asking a few questions to them, and they are going to dialogue and converse with each other. And after that, we are going to be open it for Q&A from the audience. So you all that are assisting to this seminar can participate. And that part is going to be moderated by our colleague, Ruben Hernandez Leon. By the way, the Q&A part, you can ask questions, it's going to be in English and Spanish, English or Spanish, whatever you prefer. Okay. So with that being said, then let me introduce our first speaker today, La Profesora Sandra Mendiola Garcia, who is an associate professor and associate chair of the Department of History at the University of North Texas, UNT. She teaches classes on labor, gender, and food history in Latin America. Mendiola is mostly interested in invisible, informal, and precarious kinds of labor at different sites. That includes streets, home, and the mining industry. Her book, Street Democracy, was published by the University of Nebraska Press in 2017. Now she's currently writing a second monograph on silver miners in central Mexico in the 20th century. She's also an associate review editor of the American Historical Review. So please let's, welcome Sandra Mendiola, and I'll give you the virtual floor so you can introduce your book. Adelante.
Muchísimas gracias. Primero que nada, quisiera dar las gracias a UCLA, Latin American Institute, and the Center of Mexican American Studies at UT Arlington. Y sobre todo a Christian por darnos esta oportunidad de presentar nuestros trabajos. I'd like to say that on behalf of my co-panelists, who are brilliant scholars, brilliant women, and wonderful friends, that this is a moment to celebrate our books, particularly because their books came out very shortly before the pandemic hit or during the pandemic, right? So there was no time for discussion and to welcome these books. Well, I'm going to share my screen. Sorry for that. Okay, everybody can see it? Yes. So street democracy studies a group of street vendors in Puebla, which is one of Mexico's largest cities, during the beginning of the 1970s to roughly the beginning of the 1990s. The book studies the political activities of a group of street vendors that in 1973 formed a union, la Unión Popular de Vendedores Ambulantes 28 de Octubre, that fought for vendors' right to make a living. This union was very different to other unions in Mexico because it remained independent of the ruling Partido Revolucionario Institucional, or the Institutional Revolutionary Party, who had co-opted other unions. Now, the independence of this union and the militancy of this union basically challenged municipal, state, and federal authorities. In fact, one of the most interesting sources that I was able to use for this book were federal intelligence records that were declassified recently. And these records basically trace the everyday political activities of street vendors. But the book doesn't only focus on the leaders or the union as an institution, but also looks particularly at the many kinds of labors that female vendors carried out. So I show that women carried out economic, political, and social reproductive labor on the streets of Puebla. And I was able to do this because of oral history interviews, photographic material, and cultural artifacts. Now, the book also shows the state repression that vendors faced during several decades, actually to the present, because the union still continues to exist. And I argue that some of that excessive repression is similar to the one experienced by other groups during the Mexican Dirty War. And finally, the book shows at the very end the gentrification of Puebla's downtown that in 1987 became a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Prior to that year, around 1985, 1986, street vendors and market vendors were expelled from the downtown area, right, to make room to renovate the historical buildings and so and that kind of rhetoric. But really what happened is that vendors were expelled and large retailers connected to the global economy, such as Walmart, then began occupying prime spaces in downtown Puebla. So I think I still have a couple of 1 minute maybe, and I'm going to show you a few photographs. So this is a march of the street vendors, the Unión Popular de Vendedores Ambulantes in the early 1970s, a very militant since then. These are photographs of one of the female vendors that I was able to interview. And in this image to the left, you can see her negotiating with Puebla's mayor. To the right is the same vendor, right? But carrying out these theater play that the vendors organized. And the last photograph in the bottom is the same vendor many, many years later with her daughter and the grandchild, right? So this gives you a sense of all the work that they are doing at the same time, right? Political, taking care of children, and of course, selling their merchandise. This is a photograph of the Mercado de la Victoria in 1910. Outside of the market, the vendors occupy all sorts of streets, right? As you can see here, a large amount of vendors selling their merchandise. This is very close to Day of the Dead, so there's a lot of activity. And then, of course, here we see a photograph of the before and after, right? After vendors were expelled. We see the market just with stores that included 2 retailers from Walmart, a restaurant and a department store. Well, thank you so much, and I'll pass the microphone to my next panelist.
Thank you, Sandra. Beautiful pictures, and I hope that later in the discussion we can address some of the issues that you brought in this presentation, including the role of state repression. So we move now to our second participant, Christina Jimenez, who is a professor in the Department of History at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs. She has a PhD in an MA in Latin American history from the University of California, San Diego. She teaches and does research in Mexican history, Latin American history, comparative urban history, and citizenship studies. Her book, Making an Urban Public, How the City Revolutionized Citizenship in Morelia, Mexico, between 1880 and 1930, was published by University of Pittsburgh Press in 2019, and was named as an outstanding academic title of 2019 by Choice, a publication of the American Libraries Association. Her current book project is entitled A City of Sellers, The Politics of Urban Space and Street Vendors in Guadalajara, Mexico, between 1870 and 1940. Jimenez has received several recognitions and honors, including most recently the USCS Chancellor's Award, and as well as an award for faculty contributions to diversity and inclusiveness, among others. So, Christina, please go ahead and welcome.
Gracias, Christian. Thank you. First, I just want to echo Sandra's thanks to my co-panelists and to our sponsors. I'm going to just start sharing my screen And let me see. Okay. Yes, apologies, Christian. I think the title that was on that bio I sent you had an earlier subtitle for the book. That's my error. My book is called Making an Urban Public: Popular Claims to the City in Mexico. And it focuses on a time period much earlier than that of Sandra's. This is from the 1870s through the 1930s. This period in Mexican history was a period of tremendous change, transformations in terms of the application of technologies, rural to urban migration. Of course, this period spans the Mexican Revolution of 1910. And Making an Urban Public is really getting at recovering stories and narratives of working class peoples, recent migrants to the city who learned how to engage in politics with the municipal and state governments of this one city that I focus on, Morelia. It's the capital of the state of Michoacan. And my resource base for this, which I can talk about a little bit more later, is just thousands of petitions that everyday residents of Morelia wrote across these decades, engaging with the city and municipal authorities about their own visions of what Morelia should look like, how the kind of modernization projects could impact their own neighborhoods, how they wanted to participate in the consumer culture and popular culture that was expanding. By using all these voices that I hear of popular residents in the petitions, I'm able to create through my different chapters what I kind of have framed as different types of cities that I see. And these different cities are articulating different groups' visions of what Morelia and the city could be to them. So one chapter is called The Modernized City. And one chapter is called The Spectacular City. And one chapter is called The Network City. It gets at kind of associations and unions that emerged through the early 1900s through 1930s. Really what I'm trying to do in this book is challenge some of the meta narratives that have dominated the history of Mexico during this period, the Porfiriato and Revolution and establishment of the post-revolutionary state. And I'm really trying to kind of reinsert this, this narrative of these strategic and savvy and persistent claims of ordinary Morelians to the popular spaces of the shared public spaces, I should say, of the city. I have a few images that I'll share here. Let's see, how do I advance the slide? There we go. This is just a photo of downtown Morelia in the late 1800s. And you can see that here we have street paving. The public spaces of the city, the main park just down the way there, became a place of lots of contestation and negotiation about how vendors wanted to have access to this space to sell their goods, to support their families, to advance their lives. And you know what I kind of talk about is people really wanted to have access to the promise of the city and the promises of you know, modern life. One of the this is just one little example that I think this image highlights. Many neighborhoods really wanted sidewalks, and you can see why. I mean, the sidewalk lifted residents out of the mud and muck of the streets. They demanded sewers and drainage pipes and street lighting and all sorts of things that were going to really impact their everyday lives. And of course, this last image is of just street sellers. And here they are on a paved street, a cobblestone street, I should say. And you know, this type of kind of use of public spaces was a primary survival strategy for many women and men and migrants to the city, not just as vendors, but as all sorts of service workers. So my book is really getting at those narratives. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I will pitch it to the next panelist because we're trying to keep these brief.
Thank you, Christina. I love how you bring that long historical perspective to the topic that we are discussing today. You know, the long roots of the struggles that street vendors have engaged for a long time. Next, I want to introduce next speaker, Ingrid Bleynat, who is a senior lecturer in international development at the Department of International Development in King's College London. She joined King's College upon completing her PhD in history at Harvard University. And before that, she was trained as an economist at the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina. Ingrid's research focuses on the political economy of Latin America, with particular emphasis in Mexico and Argentina. She's written on the relationships between informality and corruption, and about the long-run relationship between wages, well-being, and inequality, which is a topic that doesn't seem to go away. We have more inequality than ever before. Her book, Vendors, Capitalism, A Political Economy of Public Markets in Mexico City, was published by Stanford University Press in 2021. She's currently doing fieldwork on the link between income inequality and social reproduction arrangements in Buenos Aires. So, Ingrid, bienvenida, adelante.
Bueno, yo también quiero empezar agradeciéndole a mis colegas y amigas y a los organizadores y a los sponsors del evento. I'm really happy to be here to talk about our books, but also to have a joint conversation to hopefully start working collectively into our new adventures. Now, my book, as Christian was saying, is the political economy of public markets in Mexico City, and the period I cover is from the 1860s to the 1960s. So my book has a huge overlap with Christina's book, and we would tell you later that we reach very similar conclusions in many regards, and stops before Sandra's book starts. So I think it's we have a lot to tell each other about markets in Mexico. Now, markets are a public service, and I'm interested in the street vendors as part of markets, because those tripod parasols that Christina was showing us in her last slide, they were parts of markets. They were regulated as markets, tasks as markets, and very much a part of the history that I'm trying to tell in my book. But public markets more broadly were a public service supplying urban populations of basic goods, and governments were consistently committed to building the infrastructure, maintaining it, and managing the relations that took place in those spaces. Let me see if I can share my screen. I'm terrified. So this commitment we can see in a lot of images. This is a picture from the beginning of the 20th century, when you have the Porphyrian halls that Christina was talking about, together with all sorts of street vending arrangements that were governments at that time were trying to separate, but that's only one point in history, and the fluidity between street and markets never stops in the history that I covered in my book. But my interest in doing the research and writing this book was in particular on social relations of production, that is, vendors' social relations of production. Vendors who are neither wage workers, that is, they don't sell their labor force for a wage to a capitalist, but not capitalist either, because they don't hire workers, they don't manage to accumulate capital, and they work by themselves, mostly with the help of their families. So the vendors that we're talking about and that I try to focus on are self-employed, and I call them proprietary traders in the book, following Jack Womack's formulation on the topic. Now, what they do, these vendors, is, so in terms of these social relations of production, what they do is they go visit wholesale depots, they buy stuff, they transport stuff, they sort stuff, they promote stuff, and they sell stuff. That's the work they do, and that's how they create value. But they are not operating in isolation. They have relations with suppliers and creditors that tend to be quite exploitative. That is, they experience exploitations through exchange by these suppliers and creditors in the form of the prices that they pay for the merchandise that they will sell, and in the interest rates that they will pay for the loans they get to buy that merchandise, because most of the time they're working on credit. So that's something that I wanted to get to in the book. But as I looked in the sources, there was very little about that. And what you had was, I uncovered some stuff that I will tell you about later, but they're also in serious competition with one another. And the sources are full. And for some reason, historical works on vendors tend to not focus on this very bitter, very brutal at times competition between vendors. That is, they experience some kind of intra-class competition that required management. You could see it here. This is a Porfirian market by the 1920s, overwhelmed by street vendors. And those stalls that you see outside of the hall, they are parts of market. And all the time, what we have is conflicted relationship between people in the different streets that form La Lagunilla market, el Mercado de La Lagunilla. You can see to the right a plan where the government of the city decides to map all the areas occupied by vendors. And they have obviously ideas of how they want to rationalize that. So I'm looking at not only the social relations of production of vendors with suppliers and creditors, the competition they experience within their class, and also the conflicts that they experience with their consumers, especially at times of high inflation, when governments repeatedly tried to control retail prices, short-circuiting their place in supply chains in the city. So very much like Christina was saying, vendors responded by petitioning the authorities and responded by collective action, especially during and after the revolution. They start forming unions, they start forming organizations, and they do so to make their demands on the government. And what they want consistently is government intervention and protection. And this in the form of infrastructure to ply their trade, subsidized credit to overcome this exploitative relationship they have with their suppliers and creditors, but also they consistently try to engage the government in the suppression of their competitors among their own class. So all of these relations, all of these petitions, all of these conflicts, I argue in the book, very much like Christina does, shape the public sphere, shape popular politics, and also shape state institutions. I don't know if I made it in 3 minutes, but I will stop there.
Thank you, Ingrid, and I think that, you know, all of the very rich topics that you have brought in this brief presentation, this thing about the conflicts, not just with outside actors and agencies that try to regulate their work, but also internally with their suppliers and consumers, add, you know, the new dimension that we have to really think when we try to conceptualize them as you know, working in public spaces. Finally, I want to now introduce last speaker, Rocio Rosales, who is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of California in Irvine. She completed her PhD in sociology at UCLA and received her AD in sociology with a certificate in Latin American studies from Princeton University. Her research interests include international migration, immigrant and ethnic communities, and economies, race and ethnicity, and law and society, among others. Her book, Fruteros, Street Vending, Illegality and Ethnic Community, was published by the University of California Press in 2020. The book was the recipient of the American Sociological Association Latino section Distinguished Contribution to a Scholarship Book Award. So welcome, Rocío. Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm gonna share my screen very quickly. And I will say that as the odd person out here, as the only sociologist in a panel of historians, I'm really gonna lean into the difference by showing photographs in color because I'm studying a contemporary group of fruit vendors in Los Angeles. So I am an ethnographer. And between 2006 and 2012, I spent time with a group of fruteros or fruit vendors who sold fruit out of push carts like the ones you see here throughout the city of Los Angeles. So one of the most iconic visuals of Los Angeles is perhaps this rainbow umbrella that many vendors throughout the city use, but specifically fruit vendors. And so between 2006 and 2012, I spent time with one group, and they all ended up being from Puebla, a small city in the Mexican state of Puebla. And contrary to what other books here are arguing, I really focused on the community of vendors that I was spending time with. And I mapped out the network of all these individuals and how they were related to each other. The context, of course, is that they're operating in Los Angeles, which at the time had the most prohibitive anti-vending ordinance in the country. And yet their numbers are pervasive. In Los Angeles, there are about 50,000 street vendors that operate on any given day. Of those 50,000, 10,000 are food vendors. And then of those 10,000 who sell only food, about 1,000 are fruit vendors. So just to give you a sense of the numbers of vendors operating in the metropolis that is Los Angeles. And so I focused very specifically on fruteros. I approached many of them who were working in different parts of town from East, Central, Northeast Los Angeles. And I found out very slowly that a lot of them were from the same community in Puebla. And so because of this connection that they all had to each other, this network, the book that I write ends up being about how vendors relate to each other when a person who might be your employer is also sometimes your landlord or your roommate, and in some cases, your romantic partner. So what does it mean to live and work and socialize with this community of people in an occupation that is heavily surveilled and under which crackdowns are continuously continuing, which brings economic precarity to the network. And so given that I'm focusing on the individuals laboring in this somewhat hostile context of reception, the main contribution that I make in my book is about the ethnic cage, that the way in which immigrants relate to each other. And I say that the ethnic cage is large and invisible and functions to corral community while keeping threats at bay. These are undocumented Mexican immigrants working in the streets of Los Angeles. So for some, the ethnic cage is small, visible, and functions to confine the individual, while at the same time that community is harmed. So this is like the dual nature of the cage. It is useful to be part of this community because you can get a job, but that same community can be exploitative in some ways when you don't get paid for your labor. And so in that way, it relates somewhat to Ingrid's work and the way in which working in this arena can both be beneficial and exploitative because of the conditions, because of the structure in which they're operating. And so in the book, I argue that newcomers, these new immigrants, are not turned away. Their paisanaje grants them entry into the community, but it does not guarantee benevolence. And so that's the major theoretical hook of the book. And I'm sure that in the Q&A we can have a meaningful discussion about the different types of work that we can do with the units of analysis that we have and the data that we have. And of course, these are fruteros who are operating in Los Angeles who may or may not be leaving a paper trail for historians of the future to understand and make sense of their lives. So I'll stop here, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Rocio, and for bringing the discussion up to the present in California. So we're moving to the second part of the webinar, when we are gonna be asking a few questions to the authors so they can speak with each other. But before doing so, I want to publicly thank them all for coming together for this seminar. It was a great opportunity, I think, to learn about each other's work, and it has been a pleasure to work with them to prepare the event. So I want to thank them. So I'm gonna ask the first question to you, which is that in all your books deal with the street and market vendors and their networks, right? So how does your work as historians and sociologists help us to better understand the challenges these workers have faced and how they have responded to them?
I think one of the most interesting things in my work that I think parallels what everyone else here has talked about is the idea of activism in street vending and among street vendors. And so the interesting thing then becomes, within the community of fruteros that I followed, there was a lack of mobilization and involvement in a very active street vending campaign. And so while that street vending campaign is pulling in older immigrant women and creating all this information for posterity, the fruteros that I'm following are very much not actively not engaging in a movement that they don't see as their own, because in their heads, they're not thinking of trying to make their lives better for themselves in the United States. They're thinking of remitting money back home to Mexico so that they can build a home in return. And so they don't, as I'm spending time with them, these vendors are between 18 and 25 years old. They don't see themselves as having a future in this country, and therefore are not engaging in the mobilization campaign. And for all intents and purposes, not leaving a paper trail of what they're doing in the city for others to follow. And so I think that that's an interesting sort of entry point when you're having an interdisciplinary conversation about vendors and networks and the differences that might exist in what sociologists and historians do when they approach these types of topics. Ingrid, you're muted.
Yes, it always happens. It always happens. I want to follow up from there. So I found reading your book absolutely fabulous and fascinating. And to me, it makes me pose the question of how the same activity in different contexts yields very different outcomes, because it's very much they're doing the same stuff that the guys and the women that we are studying do, but they act so differently, as you were saying. For me as a historian, and maybe I'm representing Christina and Sandra, especially Christina, because we work with very similar sources, the fact that we are looking at a context in which street vending was part of markets, unregulated and accepted as such, sometimes with more repression, sometimes with less repression, but always part of these urban spaces that we're studying, means that our work is very state-centered, because the sources are very state-centered. The sources that we use from the archives allow us to look at how vendors engage with the authorities in what Christina's book, I think, I'm not sure I'm quoting you correctly, but for this 1870s to the 1930s, you're talking about making of a modern public, while at the same time exposing the contradictions and the limits of elites' projects for the city, which demand certain patterns of behavior from these popular classes, but at the same time only include a subset of those who are willing to embrace those behaviors in this modern city. So those mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion are much more fluid and much more negotiated in the sources we work with as historians. We have a lot of material to track this. Like Christina was saying, that the ayuntamiento, the city council files, the files of the governor or the Departamento del Distrito in our cases. And very much like Sandra was saying, I also use the intelligence services documents, because that fascinating part of that is that the PRI might have been patrolling opposition, but also all the groups that made the pro-growth compact that they were managing. So I think for us to be able to have this conversation across disciplines, where you work not with the same type of economic activity, but in different contexts, and working with from different perspectives, because the sources we use are so different, is very enriching.
Christina or Sandra, you want to?
I'll jump in. So, I mean, what I would add is that in terms of the historical kind of narrative and trajectory, the networks that are often associated with street vendors are unions. The unions that are formed based on their, common situation as workers, that are then connected to different political parties at different times in Mexico, and also connected to coalitions and confederations of unions and workers that really emerged in the 1920s and 1930s in Mexico in the post-revolutionary state period. Now, while that's true, part of what my work and research is highlighting is how there's actually another history to these networks, that many of these networks are rooted in just the practice of collective organizing and activism for vendors in particular and sellers around the public spaces that they want to, maintain some claim over. So these could be their, their need and their right. They feel, their kind of real right to be selling in the central plaza of the city, or to be selling along the exterior sidewalks or streets of the markets, as Ingrid's work really highlights, and as well as Sandra's in the later period. So my point is that the history of networking and activism among vendors, we see as often in the 20th century, kind of rooted in our frame of unions. And then we tend to think about vendor activism as almost starting with their unionization. But, I would just really reassert that actually it's the activism that creates the synergy and the foundation for the establishment of unions that are then connected to what become, very meaningful kind of political alliances. And Ingrid actually does an amazing job in her work showing how through this century, because she's covering from 1860 through the 1960s, through this century, vendor activism was able to connect these vendor unions of poor, often migrant men and women working in public areas of the city and the markets to these large political confederations that become part of the post-revolutionary state in Mexico. So that's what I would add to. And Sandra?
Okay, yeah, so I think that my work is kind of in between Christina and Ingrid's book, because I kind of trace how up to the mid 1980s, like, yes, there's a lot of negotiation between the Street Vendors Union and the state, right? Sometimes it doesn't work, but sometimes it works, right? And vendors are able to use public spaces, right? The sidewalk, the places outside the markets, just like their fabulous pictures show. These are prime spaces, right? But then, right, we have the so-called neoliberal turn. In the case of Mexico, around the 1980s, and at different moments, And what we see is the privatization of public space in which we vendors cannot sell in these places where the street or the markets of downtown, right? So here, you know, my work, I think, parallels a little bit with Rocio's work, right? In which vendors are kind of using this space in which they are always being harassed, right? In which they are always fearing detentions and police raids, right? And ready to kind of run away when necessary, right? But I think this transition is important to understand, right? Like how it goes from a public use of space, relatively speaking, to a almost untouchable space, right? That is only open to Starbucks and to Kentucky Fried Chicken and, you know, all these retailers connected to the global economy.
Well, thank you. And I'm sure that, you know, in the Q&A, we'll be able to come back to some of the issues that you have raised. But I think that it's something that becomes clear is that some of you, including you, Christina, were pointed out that, but sociologists and anthropologists that are working on the present, sometimes, you know, we tend to think of these movements for labor organization or unionization as something new. You know, this long historical perspective shows us that, you know, the long roots of these networks, and it's important to take them into account. I want to move now to a different question, which focuses on women and migrants, because both women and migrants to the city constitute a central segment of informal vendors in cities in Mexico, but also in the US. I want to ask you, how does a gender and or migrant perspective bring new light to understand the individual and collective strategies these workers have developed to reclaim the city as a public space for their work? And you want to start, Christina?
Yes, I'll start. Thank you. And Ingrid, I think you need to mute, just FYI. So in terms of the, you know, well, from a historical perspective, I think it's really important to think about as historians what we have access to, what we don't have access to, and how the historical sources really do limit kind of our lens of getting at certain questions. And that's why an interdisciplinary conversation like this, bringing in Rocio and Sandra's perspective, where they were able to get into kind of the more individualized personal lives and stories of these vendors, is really important. Ingrid had mentioned that, you know, looking at the historical period, we are constrained by some of the sources that we have that are often sources that are produced and then preserved by the state. In this case, in my particular case, it's the municipality of Morelia, the municipio. What I argue though, and what I discovered is that in this period in the late 19th century, it's a period of regulation and state codification. So the bureaucracy is growing. The number of codes, urban codes and policies that residents have to follow are just increasing. The state is publicizing this to the residents, telling them what their responsibilities and obligations are. You know, everything from, you know, the establishment and kind of almost, it had happened before, but the reinforcement of the role, for example, of block bosses. These are kind of neighborhood directors who were supposed to make sure that people, you know, washed and swept their stoop and the sidewalk in front of their house. And so there's a proliferation of codes and regulations. And, you know, my point here is that what's so amazing about this archive in Morelia, and I have found it in Guadalajara as well, is that the codes allowed an opening, an opportunity for all sorts of people to petition the municipal government to say, yes, you want us to clean our sidewalks, but guess what? We don't have a sidewalk. So could you actually fund a sidewalk along this street? And it's often women and families who are doing this type of activism and petitioning. They're also using rhetoric that is kind of strategically echoed back to the state about how, they need access to paved streets and, a place where they can sell that has a coverage for the rain, protection from the elements, because they need a space to sell their goods in order to support their families so that they're not destitute, so that they can actually continue to, be active participating citizens. And the use of this rhetoric that I see in the petitions, for me, and I should say the participation of recent migrants to the city, and of course women, I mean, it really evidences how they're there and they're savvy and they're doing what they can to engage politically at a time when they don't have a lot of options politically. So I don't know who should I throw it to?
Yes. I can continue. I just wanted to share a photograph, and of course, I'm nervous here trying to find the photograph, but yeah. This photograph of Paola Javier, who was one of the women that I was able to interview before she passed. And it was pretty amazing how just by coincidence, right, I was able to find a photograph of her when she was young, talking to the mayor. And, there are men and women here in this photograph, but she was the most active. She's not afraid of anything, but she's a woman who has several children, very poor. She has no other options than getting engaged in politics, and is one of the main leaders at the very, very beginning of the union inception. And I think she's representative of many others who, on many cases, are recent migrants from the countryside who have tons of children. Many of them are single mothers, and they are there, bien puestas. I don't know how to say that in English, but they are like ready to engage in whatever activity, right? Including the play, right? The theater play. Like, yes, let's do whatever it takes, right, to expose our demands, to expose our problems, right? And they do it while they're taking care of their children, while they are vending, while they are doing tons of work, right? So they are multitasking, and then they establish links of solidarity with one another, right? And particularly with the students in Puebla who are left-wing students. Some of them are mothers of the students, some of them are girlfriends of the students, some of them are eventually getting married to the students, right? So those connections, right, between the student movement in Puebla that the book talks about and the street vendors are not just by coincidence, right? These are created alliances in which the women are very, very important. But again, like Christina said, the sources are very important, right? Like, I think in more recent times, right, it's easier to find the women because you can still find them and talk to them. Thank you. Okay.
Let me jump in. So I personally didn't find there was much difference in how male and female vendors petitioned the authorities. And race did not feature in my sources either. But having said that, all of your work, from which I learned so much, as well as Susie Porter's work, from which all of us have learned so much, you all highlight that there's very good reason to believe that female vendors are overrepresented among street vendors in comparison with market vendors. And it's the street vendors that face more precarity and more repression. So that is certainly, but I think I'll let Rocio answer, who will have much more to say.
No, all of this is really interesting and fascinating, and there are multiple threads that I want to pull on. But I want to say that when I was doing the work, I was spending time with fruteros who were majority men in this occupation, and I would continuously ask, why is there an overrepresentation of men among this particular? Because generally, there are a lot of women who are vendors, street vendors. And I think if you're looking at the numbers generally in Los Angeles, women probably are more often street vendors than men. But among fruteros, it was young men. And so they would often say, oh, because you need physical strength to push the cart up, up ramps. And I think that might have been one of the answers, but it was probably more networks than anything else, and recent, migrant arrivals. And so I'm spending time with fruteros who are young men, and at the same time, there's a mobilization campaign happening where vendors, largely women, largely, older, sometimes grandmothers, are engaging in this activism with the Los Angeles street vendor campaign and petitioning City Hall and, and making these beautiful claims about how they belong in the city, and they are the lifeblood of the city. And so I see the contrast in gender and in age between those who aren't petitioning the city and those who are. And some of the points that Christina made are really interesting to me because of the sources that are created and preserved by the state. I remember very early on in my research, I was fresh off undergrad, where I had read Chauncey's book on gay New York. And one of the things that he does in that book is that he looks at police records, of these rates that they have at bars. And I remember thinking, like, I'm going to look at the police records. And what becomes very difficult when I start looking at the citations just that the vendors are receiving is that they're receiving citations not for anti-vending ordinances, but they're receiving citations for loitering, for being a public nuisance. And so I'm thinking, how is it possible then to look at this state-created documentation of citations and identify specifically which are given to vendors, because they're not being cited for an anti-vending policy? And so if you're just looking at loitering, all kinds of people get loitering tickets, and public nuisance tickets. And so it becomes very difficult then to understand through the documents created by the state where vendors fit in, because they're hidden in all these different ways. When the documents that are being left consistently are by community stakeholders and neighborhood associations that are actively writing to police departments saying, you need to come to our neighborhood and crack down on the vendors that we consider a nuisance. And then paper from the LAPD PR people responding to the neighborhood association saying, we hear you, but in terms of all the policing work that we have to do, policing street vendors is actually really low on our priority list. And so you have these conversations that are being captured in documents of the government that are all about vending, but not being created by vendors, and very specifically by the vendors that I'm following. And so, Christina talks about a space in which urban codes are growing. Well, Los Angeles has one of the most defined and longest municipal county ordinances. I remember reading through it, and there's an ordinance in Los Angeles that prohibits riding on the handles of a bicycle through the city. And so you could potentially get a ticket for that. So this is just how extensive the municipal code is in terms of creating a rule and law for or against that. So these vendors are operating in a city with a very well-defined municipal county code, with a very well-defined enforcement force in the LAPD, in the Bureau of Street Cleaning Services, in public health. And you're still seeing a lot of these same things where, instead of block buses that Christina is talking about, the vendors themselves police themselves to keep their corners clean, because they know that if they leave an unsightly sort of corner after they leave, then the business owners in the area are going to crack down on them, are going to call the cops on them and really call them a nuisance or loitering. And so all of the ways that the fruteros are operating are comparable, but in many ways they're not leaving a public record of these activities for posterity. And so I think the most interesting thing that I'm able to do as an ethnographer is spend time in these spaces with a recorder, just recording the conversations that they're having about enforcement, about crackdowns, and maybe creating a record of conversations that are otherwise not going to be captured by any state source. And so this is, one of the many sort of interesting threads that you can pull on when you think of how to understand communities that might not leave a lot of records, and what happens when that's the case, and what kinds of stories can you tell or not tell.
Well, thank you. Yeah, this is fascinating. And unfortunately, I want to move to the last question, so we leave enough time for the audience to ask you questions and interact with you. But I'm sure that some of those issues are going to come back later. So the last question is just to ask you all, what lessons did you learn in terms of the relationships between local politics, informal economies, and cities? How can your book help other researchers, but also policy makers, address the challenges today's fast-growing cities confront? So it's bringing a little bit of discussion from the theoretical part, but also fit to the public policy dimension.
I'll start. Now, this is a very difficult question to tackle. As a historian, I don't want to impose my current concerns or my contemporary anxieties on the past. But what I would highlight as a lesson, and the lesson that I learned from my research, is that there was tremendous democratic force in vendors' actions in the city. That is, yes, they were constrained by a capitalist state, but the history of the city would read very differently without taking into account their demand for government intervention, their willingness to be modern, to be part of this expansion of capitalism. They kept on holding governments accountable for the promise of urban progress, for the promise of opportunities to improve their material and social lives. And that, I think, is at the center of this negotiation of the political management of the expansion of capitalism. Yes, done through party politics, yes, through a lot of cooptation, but without which I don't know what we have left. And I guess by means of an answer, to take it to the Q&A and for discussion, I would like to propose a thought experiment. If you remove the type of state-vendor relations and all of the mediations that come with it, what do you have left? How can you manage these urban spaces? I know this is in contrast to the literature that focuses on clientelism, on urban populism, on corruption. And I'm not saying that those are not serious issues for today's fast-growing cities. But in the absence of this type of mediated relations, my question is, what kind of institutions, what kind of organizations would appear to fill the vacuum? Because we know that clearly something would appear and does appear when the state steps back from organizing public spaces and from managing social relations taking place in those spaces. And I'm not particularly optimistic of what might appear. But I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that.
I can jump in. I think I want to answer your last question, Ingrid. I think when one removes the state, right,
like it has been happening little by little recently, at least in the case of Puebla. What we see is a savage commercialization in which only the wealthy, those who can afford paying taxes or paying for spaces, are able to survive in prime spaces. And we see kind of the community deteriorates, right? And it becomes a very elitist public space. And that has many consequences. One of them, and I just want to say something I didn't study in the book, but I'm kind of always thinking I should go back to that, is the homogenization of food, for example, right? When you remove all the street vendors from downtown, who many of them sold very typical Puebla antojitos, right? And then they're gone. And what do you have? Well, you have Starbucks-like, you have pizza, you have burgers. You can be anywhere in the United States and you still be finding the same thing in Puebla, right? In Puebla. That doesn't mean that that's the only thing you have, but you have to chase it, right? And a lot of these things are quite expensive now. So yes, I think that's just one of the things that could happen when you remove the state. And also answering the original question, which was about what can we learn, or for those folks who are interested in urban policies. I think what we see in our works is that there are cycles, right? That there's always the street vendors, there's always market folks, part of the informal economy or the formal economy, trying to make a living. People go out to the streets to sell, and then governments come up with the construction of markets, and then markets are built. There are stalls inside, and then again we see another wave of street vendors outside of these markets, and it's just, this is just like a never-ending cycle. And so I think we need to find ways to find more just cities in which there's the ability for everybody to be able to survive, right? In my ideal world, of course.
Yeah, those are really great ideas. And it for me, I was jotting down some notes because your comments for me really bring up almost more questions than responses. So I was kind of thinking about, I write a lot about the opportunities that people find in the city that they didn't find in the countryside, particularly in this period that I study from the late, the 1880s through the 1930s. And it makes me think about public spaces and how can we think about access to public spaces in the countryside versus in the city. As an urban historian, I know a lot about the public spaces available to migrants or to potential sellers in the city. But are there public spaces accessible to people in the countryside? There is the road, there is the church, there is maybe a small town plaza. Of course, now we know there are nature preserves that people can access. And that's kind of, this access to public space is something that we know that people that were studying sellers and vendors and workers, in this case, urban workers, they are competing for access to these spaces. This is where they have the opportunity to encounter their customers and therefore make a living. So, in that sense, it makes me think about just the role of the consumer and consumerism, because as Sandra and Garcia have both mentioned, it's like, I think everyone's mentioned it, the neoliberal turn has really kind of shifted a lot of the power to companies that are catering to customers who want a Starbucks on the corner. And maybe they want some street vendors, but they don't want that many street vendors. So there's like this threshold of desirability in terms of access to vendors among consumers in that perspective. So I'll leave it at that. And Garcia, I don't know if you have a final idea.
No, I'll pick up on some of these issues. I do agree with Sandra that this it happens in cycles and waves, you know. And when the afterword that I write in my book is really about how the election of Donald Trump actually led to an existential crisis, you know, in Los Angeles and among city leaders. And one of the things that happened was that there was a fear that this immigrant city was going to be threatened with mass deportations. And on the state level in California, and then at the local level, what politicians did is they started passing laws that would legalize vendors, recognizing that they're, you know, that they might get ticketed for vending and then be caught up in a deportation scheme, which had been happening before, you know, Trump. But for some reason, Trump presented this existential crisis that caused local and state governments in California and Los Angeles to do something about it. And so vending was legalized. And the way that I write about it in the afterword is really like, this is a silver lining that came in a very dark cloud, you know, because it was in response to the election of Donald Trump. And so very much cycles and waves. One of the things that I'm critical of, though, there is that vendors in Los Angeles had always been immigrants, had always been poor, had always functioned under the threat of deportation if they were caught up in the system. And yet they previously didn't feel the need to change the law to make their lives better. And so, you know, and again, same sentiments echoed in Christina's thought, that because there is this belief in Los Angeles that some amount of street vending should be allowed, but there is a limit and different people think where that limit is. One of the most interesting things that I know that I saw in the field when crackdowns would occur, and in heavily, you know, Latino areas with a lot of pedestrians, is the cops and the street department would come and start confiscating things and throwing away, you know, the fruit, having vendors give up their knives and their cutting boards. And what would happen is a community would form around them and start yelling at the cops. And they would say, why are you doing this to vendors? They're just trying to make a living. You should go after real criminals, you know? And so the thing that would happen is it was this ephemeral moment where you realize that the community really did stand with vendors and was, you know, fighting, at least in their rhetoric, against cops. And as soon as the raid ended, and cops would also hurry because they didn't want to gather, you know, a crowd together. And so as soon as it would end and they would move on to their next position, that same crowd that was so actively petitioning on behalf of vendors would also kind of dissipate into the background. And so you continuously saw the ways in which the community believed in vendors, in the way that they were using the street and creating these third spaces in public space. And yet all of these things, all of this kind of petitioning isn't necessarily something that reaches the levels of government where law is made, right? Because these same people who are advocating for vendors are not going to show up to city council meetings to advocate on behalf of street vendors. And so one of the most wonderful things that the Los Angeles Street Vendor Campaign, mobilization campaign did is to make everybody who's not a vendor a stakeholder in this. You know, they would go to businesses and tell them, put this sticker on your business that says, I support street vendors. Let's start thinking about street vendors as something like that is representative of what the city is. And so I think in the last few years, we have come to not only accept that vendors are part of our identity in the city, but also embrace that. And I've noticed that now in the way that journalists write about street vending in the city, you know, as something that's not going away. So how do we make room for it? And in the midst of this legalization of vending, you know, the conversation is shifting again, like Sandra said, in cycles and waves, right? For and against. And so it's all very interesting in this contemporary moment within Los Angeles.
Well, thank you. This, you know, has sparked and I think opened up a larger, very interesting discussion, and it's an excellent segue for now move to the open Q&A, and for that I'm gonna ask my colleague and friend Ruben Hernandez de Leon to please moderate that part and start.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you all for this wonderful conversation on street vending from historical and contemporary perspectives. We already have a number of questions, and I invite the audience, the members of the audience, to pose questions. We have, unfortunately, only a few minutes, so I'm going to get started right away. Eric Serna Luna is asking about the different forms of regulation that exist in street vending between Los Angeles and Mexico City. I don't know if any of our speakers wants to tackle that particular question. I'm going to go to another one that is, somewhat related. Ramon Jimenez is asking if there are differences in the reaction or reception by authorities in the cities that were analyzed here, studied here between then and now. So that's a sort of a cross-historical comparison, right? I don't know if any of our speakers wants to take one of those questions or both.
I can take very quickly because I'm actually interested in the context of reception in these other cities. And I just want to say that in the contemporary moment, there's a mix, right? Los Angeles is an immigrant-friendly city, but there are lots of laws on the books that are anti-poverty and therefore anti-immigrant. And so the context of reception is very varied. And we know that during the time that I was doing field work, there was an anti-vending ordinance. So I'm very curious to hear about the context of these other cities and time periods and whether there were similar laws on the books.
I would like to say that the difference in reactions of authorities, it really depends on the time period. As Ingrid and I know very, very well, and Christina, of course, too, that, in the 19th century, and they can explain this better, right? Particularly Ingrid with her these compassionate ideas that authorities have towards the poor. But in other times that I studied, because street vendors still pay money to authorities for the use of the sidewalk, right? I mean, it's revenue for the city. So sometimes the authorities are going to tolerate street vending, and sometimes they don't, right? When Puebla becomes a World Heritage Site, well, that's the last thing that authorities want, to have street vendors on the streets. So it really depends on the period and of time.
I could add that I don't know today, but one of the last research trips I did to Mexico City was right before the pandemic, and the 1951 or 52, I can't remember right now, bylaw for markets and vendors was still in operation. So I met with a government official in the city, and we were discussing the campaigns for refurbishing markets and transforming, especially La Merced area. But he was telling me that the bylaw was still great. The bylaw worked, and it typified the type of stalls that could take place and the type of vending activities that could take place in different parts of the city. And the problem was not the rule, the problem was the application. So it was that to add to what Sandra was saying about how these change over time, but the level of enforcement also changes over time, even if it remains the same in the book.
Thank you. I saw a question that for a moment it sort of vanished, but there was a question about about how a lot of the conversation seems to be happening on or focusing on in individuals, and this particular audience member was asking about the role of couples or families in organizing vending.
So I don't have very much to say, but I want to say something, because in the same bylaw, the idea is that there could only be one stall in a market per family. The regulations in place in Mexico City support this proprietary trading. And yes, there are ways of bypassing that. So if you have a first partner and a second wife, and then your child is a grown-up, and they might somehow get a lot of stalls in a particular market through a lot of connections and political relations, but very much in the regulations is the idea that these are family units.
I'll add to that very, very quickly. And I also see there's a question that kind of looks at or asks about the costs and benefits of vending versus standard jobs. And, you know, even in this earlier historical period, it is very clear that these are families working together. Yes, single women are also represented, but often their children are involved in some aspect of the kind of selling enterprise, especially as they get older and they can maybe, you know, call people from the street corner to come over to the stand. Street vending allows, at least what I saw, lots of flexibility for families to cover one another when maybe someone has to go away or when someone's not ill. It's very different in terms of what's demanded of an individual versus a single job where you have to show up for a certain amount of time in a certain place. Women are able to caregive for their children while they're, you know, also selling and working in that sense. So there are lots of benefits in terms of the flexibility of the work, and it is a family enterprise. Although in the historical documents, sometimes that's harder to see. But Rocio, I bet you have something to say to this as well. Sandra.
No, I mean, I just want to direct people to Emira Estrada's work. She wrote a book, Kids at Work, where she focused on family units really working in spaces and specifically like how kids who were in high school sometimes would think of the work that they did, and really focusing on this idea of like how did they talk about the stigma that they sometimes felt, and how did they reconcile any issues that they might have with the money that they were earning and the benefit that they were being to the family unit. And so her work in particular is really great because of its focus in the contemporary moment on the family in public space within street vending. So I highly recommend that book.
Thank you, Rocio. Thank you all. Christina referenced the question about cost and benefits, but I want to read it out loud so we can, you know, maybe a little bit more of a conversation on that. This is from Vivek Ramakrishnan. Hi all, thank you so much for this amazing work. How did processes of formalization in the public sphere, whether they are unions, regulation, policing, influence vendors' attitudes towards their own work? How did vendors consider the costs and benefits of doing vendor work compared to more standard jobs with more traditional exploitative social relations production?
I'd like to ask that to answer that last question. For the street vendors of Puebla, for this particular group that I studied, I think the union was much more than a union, right? I mean, the union protected them, right, and the right to make a living, but it also was a space of socializing, right, of women learning a lot of things. For example, you know, how to speak in public, how to not be afraid of, you know, authorities. I remember interviewing a woman who said that she had never traveled anywhere, right? And it was because of the union marches and protests that they did that she was able to go to Mexico City and take the stairs, the ones that move, how to call it? I always confuse them. But the ones that moved, it was the first time that she took them. And that was, you know, for us, of course, it doesn't mean much, but for her, it was a big deal, right? To be in a big city and move around, so and make friends and sometimes become very independent, right? And this particular woman left the husband because, you know, she was able to get a lot of self confidence.
If there are no other interventions or answers to this question, I'd like to read Eric Van Young's question. What exactly or approximately, since it's likely to be overdetermined, was the state interest in corralling, regulating, and or suppressing street vending? Was it primarily aesthetic or fiscal, i.e. the informal sector escaping taxation, or to favor larger formations of capital? Is Scott's concept of legibility of use here, or is it a dull instrument?
You're
Can I
unmuted.
go?
Yeah.
First, I want to say something about the cost and benefits of vending vis-a-vis other occupations. Now, Mexico, since the 70s, has experienced a tragedy of wages. Wages are so low in the formal economy that on top of the flexibility that street vending allows, particularly those with caring responsibilities, there are no difference in average incomes. So that's something that I think we all need to acknowledge when we talk about why there's still so many people doing this type of work when there's repression or when the regulations turn against them or when there's more competition. In terms of this issue of why the state wanted to regulate coral suppress vendors, I think all of those issues that are raised in the question are very, very obvious in the sources. There are aesthetic considerations, there are public health considerations, definitely fiscal, especially in the 19th century, all the way up to the end of the 19th century. Markets and street vendors, which are part of markets, they are called that. They're called sombras. They are called. There's a taxonomy of the parts of markets, and they provide a lot of the revenue of municipal governments. In fact, 3/4 of all municipal government revenue from markets come from street vending all the way to the late 19th century. Now, I really think that, yes, there's mediation. So when you have tourist industry developing, you have negotiations between vendor unions, street vendor unions, market vendor unions, and construction companies representatives, and the Consejo Consultivo, the actas y versiones del Consejo Consultivo, especially for the years between 1929 and 1932, they are great at seeing these negotiations and how the state really is managing all of these conflicts. But I want to say something else, which I think we tend to overlook, which is that actually the interest of the state in managing these relations is managing the conflict among vendors themselves. The city becomes unmanageable if they're killing each other, if they're occupying each other's territories. And this demand for intervention in the social conflict, in the particular class conflicts that vendors experience, to me is at the center of the state's need to patrol this, to monitor this, to organize it. And in terms of legibility, the government consistently, all the way up to the 1960s, well, mostly up to the 1940s, has terrible difficulty in making it legible. So there is a tension. They do, but every time they try to do a census of vending, there's resistance. There's much more resistance to a census of vending than to entering a market at times. So, okay, long answer, but there.
Well, I just want to jump in and say really quickly, I think there is a lot to be said for the way that the state is using vending and the problem of vendors as a rhetorical tool for whatever given kind of political context they are in. So there's lots of stakeholders that would either support public vending or criticize public vending. And I think depending on the moment, as many of my co-panelists have said, they'll turn to a whole range of rhetorical arguments about why vending needs to be supported or suppressed. And it can also vary in different areas of the city. So that highlights the kind of aesthetic concerns, consumer concerns, or even kind of commercial competition. I know we're getting close to time, so I'm going to wrap it up.
Thank you, Christina. Yes, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but this has been a fantastic conversation. I want to invite all of our viewers now and when they watch the recording later on to actually engage these books. And you know, not only to watch this webinar, which is, of course, everybody's invited to watch it, to use it. It's going to be available on YouTube and Facebook Live. And it can be a resource for teaching and other purposes, research, etc. But actually, I want to encourage everybody to actually read these books because they're phenomenal. This is just the beginning, I trust, of a longer and, as today, very deep conversation about these matters across disciplines and connecting the past to the present and thinking about the future, of course.